So the claim that I'm responding to is that raising the federal minimum wage will have a negative impact on the economy. So, and the advocate's secondary claims that I'm going to respond to are first, that increasing the federal minimum wage will increase unemployment. Second, that it will hurt the poor. Third, that it will cause inflation. And fourth, that it will hurt small business. So first, increasing the federal minimum wage will increase unemployment. The advocate's evidence was that companies will choose to lay people off if they are forced to pay more for the labor. But this isn't that big of a deal because unemployment is a part of any functioning economy. Even in full employment, where an economy, it's a situation where an economy uses all of its labor to the most economically efficient means, there's still unemployment. And then their other evidence was that raising minimum wage will increase the cost of labor. But this also isn't necessarily harmful to the economy. Higher cost for unskilled labor isn't that big of a deal because it can provide incentive to automate. So agriculture has been automating for the past 200 years, and due to increasing labor costs. And an example is from an article by the economist.com, Fields of Automation. In 2006, harvesting an acre of raisins cost around $500, but in 2008 with automation, it cost around $300. So lower operating costs allow for more capital to be reinvested or lower prices, which helps the economy. And then their third piece of evidence was that it would hurt entry-level workers providing them with work experience. But again, that doesn't matter because skilled labor has had unpaid internships for a long time, and that's a way for workers to get experience without necessarily having to be paid. So that's the solution to that. Their second secondary claim was that increasing the federal minimum wage would hurt the poor, but that's not that big of a deal. Minimum wage workers make up a small amount of the workforce. According to Bureau of Labor Statistics stats from 2015, the U.S. has about 150 million workers, and only 870,000 worked at the federal minimum wage, and that's not taking into account things like overtime, commissions, or tips. And of those workers, only 300,000 worked full-time. So some other evidence that they offered was that the living wage in LA County was $12.44 an hour, but the applicant committed a hasty generalization here. California, and especially LA, have an abnormally high cost of living, so it's unreasonable to use them for justification for the federal minimum wage. According to the payscale.com, the cost of living in LA is 50% higher than the national average, and the cost of housing is over 150% higher. So the advocate's third supporting claim was that increasing the federal minimum wage will increase inflation, and then some evidence they offered was that a higher cost of labor means a higher cost of goods, but this isn't true. It's only a potential response to increased cost of labor. And it will only happen if producers were unable to lower the cost of labor or unwilling to take a cut in their profit margins. And again, automation is a solution here. For example, according to a Huffington Post article, self-serve kiosks have been implemented in Australia for years due to the abnormally high cost of labor there. They have a minimum wage that's equivalent to about $10.70. And if automation is cheaper than the cost of labor, it would mean, again, more capital for the company to reinvest, which would be beneficial to the economy. They also claim that decreasing the value of the dollar, increasing the federal minimum wage would decrease the value of the dollar due to greater disposable income, but this also isn't true. If it wouldn't increase everyone's disposable income, it would just make it so that certain people didn't have a job if they didn't produce enough value. So all costs aren't going to raise because of that, because not everyone's going to have more disposable income. And the advocate's final claim was that increasing the federal minimum wage will hurt small business, but they didn't define small business. their evidence was that small business might not be able to afford the higher cost of labor, but they didn't define small business. According to the U.S. Small Business Administration, small business is defined based upon industry and sub-industry, and it varies based on what industry you're in. So typical amounts are below $7.5 million to $27.5 million in receipts, or employing under 500 to 1,250 employees. And small business is more than a bit of a misnomer, because people typically wouldn't consider under a few dozen million dollars in receipts or under a few hundred employees to be small business. And also, the majority of small businesses don't employ people. According to the U.S. Small Business Administration statistics from 2012, 78% of small businesses are non-employers. Non-employer business is one that has no paid employees and has annual business receipts of more than $1,000. So if you don't employ anyone, raising the federal minimum wage won't impact you at all. Thank you.
Right, structurally, everything's easy to follow. You signpost pretty clearly as you get to the individual points. I don't know that the first point gives you a lot of credibility when you say unemployment's not that big a deal. I think that you would find that there's going to be a vast difference of opinion on that. Your argument that says that that just simply means that they'll go to automation. Well, that's an interesting point. Automation's great for an employer, for instance. It forces them to do that, but the people who are unemployed, that's going to be a potential problem. And I think unemployment is usually a measure of the quality of the economic system and how well it's working. Your argument about, how there's a normal amount of unemployment doesn't really address the issue of whether or not you have excess of unemployment caused by high wages. And I think that, you need to do a little bit better job on that particular point. The impact, I think, is diminished a little bit by some of the argument that you give below, which I thought was a better response to that issue, especially the stuff on that last point where the small businesses represent non-employees, and then you had a statistic on the second point that suggests that only a very small percentage of people are working at the minimum wage. That seems to suggest that there aren't going to be a lot of people who are going to be affected by that. I think that's maybe the stronger argument on that point. The idea, though, that it's going to move people to automation is an interesting idea, and the notion that it's going to strengthen the economy in some way is maybe a good counterclaim. If this was a debate on policy, you could potentially argue this as a disadvantage, but you would have to quantify it and show that it does in fact have that impact and not just assert the impact. If I'm saving $200 an acre, you say I'm going to reinvest and become more efficient, and I'm going, okay, well, what's the reason to believe that that's the case? Maybe I'm just going to spend the money some way or waste it on something. The idea that businesses are going to be more productive because they make that kind of savings, I think there needs to be an argument on that point. On the second point, like I said, I thought you had a very good response here. You don't really talk about the advocates' evidence very much on this, but you do have good counter evidence suggesting that only a small number of people are employed or that are trying to live at this particular wage. And I thought you had a very good challenge to the reasoning of the living wage argument that's presented, because they use the exaggerated numbers of California and Los Angeles as an illustration on that point. We're back to the automation issue on the third point. When it comes to inflation, you say it's only partially responsible. I don't know that that becomes I don't know that the automation thing responds to that particular point. Basically, you're coming back to the same argument here, suggesting that if inflation only occurs if people are going to pass the costs on, and your suggestion is that they're not going to pass the costs on. And now you're back to this idea of automation. Again, if this was a disadvantage for a policy argument that we're talking about, I think that information combined with the information above makes a stronger disadvantage. You could put those together and make a separate argument. And then, like I said, I really liked the information that you had on the fourth point that suggested that it's not going to, almost 80% of small businesses don't have employees. That's an interesting statistic. That's pretty substantial, except for themselves. I guess it's this small business owner themselves, but they don't have anybody else that works for them. So I think that diminishes that argument substantially. All right, thank you.